ಹುಡುಕಿದೆ ಇಲ್ಲದ ದೇವರ ಕಲ್ಲು ಮಣ್ಣುಗಳ ಗುಡಿಯೊಳಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಇರುವೆ ಪ್ರೀತಿ ಸ್ನೇಹಗಳ ಗುರುತಿಸದಾದೆನು ನಿಮ್ಮೊಳಗೆ. ಎಲ್ಲಿದೆ ನಂದನ ಎಲ್ಲಿದೆ ಬಂಧನ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಇದೆ ನಮ್ಮೊಳಗೆ. ಒಳಗಿನ ತಿಳಿಯನ್ನು ಕಲಕದೇ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಅಮೃತದ ಸವಿಯದೆ ನಾಲಿಗೆಗೆ. A very good evening, members. This is Ravindra Korea, Chairman of Bangalore Branch. Welcome all the delegates for this 44th live webcast from the Bangalore Branch. Today's session is very important session and from important person. There is a dialogue, we all know, powerful person come from powerful place. Like that, today's topic and very powerful past president and very active past president of ICI, that is none other than CA Amarjit Chopra sir. On behalf of all the viewers and on behalf of managing committee members of Bangalore branch, I wholeheartedly welcome Amarjit Chopra sir for this session, accepting our invitation for the today's topic, common errors in financial statements. Members, I bring to notice that a very unique personality, Amarjit Chopra, our secretary is going to introduce. I will not take, I will not say much about sir. You all know the person who has headed our institute in 2000, exactly 10 years back. For the term 10-11, sir was the president, and I was proud member because in the 4 years back, I am heading the students wing, Sikasa chairman of Bangalore branch, the Utkarsh conference. Sir, one of the speaker and addressed all the students, and today there are students. They have now converted as past CA, and now they are members. They are saying, sir, when we are when you are Sikasa heading, we are students along with you, and today we are members, and we are eager to listen from the Amarjit Chopra sir. Members, around 900 plus, nearly 1,000 members you have registered. Already 350 have joined. On behalf of managing committee of Bangalore branch, I wholeheartedly welcome all the viewers and those who are going to join 900 plus members. Members, I will not take much time. There is a few announcements. As you are aware, our Institute of Chartered Accounts of India has recently issued one announcement regarding COVID-19 package for the assistance for the members, for those who are affecting COVID and their family members. 1.5 lakh assistance is announcement is given by ICI. Kindly go through that. My wish that our no members should apply it for that, because I am praying God our no members should affect this COVID. At least for their family, I am praying God for my fraternity of chartered accountants and their family members in difficult time. So coming to that Bangalore branch, dear sir, Bangalore branch is started the first webinar we have conducted in 18th March before national lockdown announced. We have started in the country. The Bangalore started in 18th March webinars due to HO restrictions. Now we are coming. Today is the 44th sessions. You are having more than 45 years experience to address. Definitely our Bangalore branch members will take input from you and also guidance from you, sir. So once again I welcome Amarjit Chopra for the session, and also all the viewers for the session. So I request Secretary Srinivas to formally introduce our Honorable First President of ICI, CA Amarjit Chopra sir. Over to Srinivas.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members and viewers, and our speaker Amarjit Chopra sir. It is a very interesting session today. Common errors in financial statement, and interested to listen from sir. It is my proud privilege to give a brief introduction of Amarjit Chopra. He was a past president of ICA during 2010 and 11, and he has taken over so many committees before he is becoming a president, and he has been nominated in various committees by the central government. Highly acclaimed chartered accountant for more than 45 years. He was the president of the ICA for 2010 and 11, and he was nominated for so many various groups of central government, and he was also very interesting area of his banking, finance and insurance sector interested him immensely. which could be evidenced by his nomination as independent director to Bank of Baroda during 2006 and 9 and Indian Bank during 2011 and 14. He was appointed by the Government of India to investigate complex issues in relation to Measures Xerox India Limited. He also served as vice chairman of the high-powered committee of ICA that examined Satyam fraud in India and investigated several other matters during his career as professional auditor. He has been conferred honorary membership of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand and honorary life membership of the Association of International Accounts, London. A prolific speaker, he has delivered more than 2,900 lectures on various topics, including accounting and auditing standards, IFRS, banking, including financial inclusions, insurance, corporate law, corporate governance, ethical standards, peer review, both in India as well as abroad. He has been included on the roster of IMF as a resource person and has conducted missions in Mauritius, Bhutan, and CHLS. He has contributed articles in journals on accounting, auditing, and corporate governance, and has been part of panel discussion on these subjects on some of TV channels. He is presently on the board of Tata Power Delhi Distribution Limited, RICO, Auto Industries Limited, RICO Investment Limited, Roop Automotive Limited, and ICA Accounting Research Foundation Limited, and is on the board of Governors of Institute of Management Studies, Ghaziabad. He has keen interest in music and sports, particularly cricket. With this brief introduction, I once again present before you Amarjit Chopra.
Yeah. Sir, you can start. You can begin the session.
Okay,
As your secretary told, you are very interested in the sports is cricket. When you are speak also like that, it will come 4-6. Definitely, that will be more of the positivity is required for our members. Hope this session, your session is very interesting and important session for our Bangalore Bank members. Sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ravindraji and T. Srinivasji. Let me say one thing that I'm connected with Bangalore in more than one way, very frankly. Both of my sisters are in Bangalore and my son is in Bangalore. So I think now one of my niece actually again, she's also in Bangalore for that matter, rather granddaughters. So if you ask me, Bangalore is a sort of a place that one will be willing to come anytime because there are so many relatives to enjoy with basically. But I think it's our misfortune because of Corona, one has not been able to visit. Even I want to see my grandson there. I have not been able to visit him because of that particular reason. But Bangalore has been one of the finest places at one point of time. Of course, now it has become a concrete jungle in more than one way. I came for the first time to Bangalore. I think this is a part of the memory. And 74, I was an article clerk at that time. And at that time, the helipad at HAL was being constructed. NBCC was the agency to construct it. And we were auditing NBCC. I listed as an article clerk. And a year later, I qualified. So I think Bangalore must be having something with me. So 74, I listed, 75, I qualified. So that could be one of the things for that matter. Ravinder said that I am a powerful person from a powerful place. Yes, it could be a powerful place. I am not a powerful person. Let me be very clear about it. I think my first term in the council saw me interacting with Mr. Nityanand. He has been a very dear friend. We were together in the executive committee when I entered the council. And after Nityanand left, it was, in any case, Raghu. And Raghu went on to head the institute, basically. And then it was Madhukar Hiragenge also. When I became the president, it was first term of Madhukar Hiragenge, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, now, whatever is the situation, you need to send in somebody from Bangalore again. That's all I can just tell you. But I have enjoyed the relationship with all the council colleagues from Bangalore. And I have a very great affection for Mr. B.P. Rao for that matter. I think the first president from Bangalore for that matter. So you have already given two presidents to the institute, and we may look for more. And I think it's up to you. How do you do it? The topic for the day is very interesting. There's no doubt about it. But I think it's more of a criticism of the profession also at the same time. Once we talk of common errors in the published financial statements, it clearly means that we have been committing certain errors somewhere. And these errors are when I have not even commented upon. Let me be very clear. As an auditor, where I didn't comment upon. If it was commented upon, then probably I would not say that it is an error, because if the management did something, the auditor has tended to rectify that by commenting upon that, qualifying the reports. I am only taking up those cases which are either covered by the FRRB in their reports, or where I have come across in my reading of the public funding of the financial statements of the listed entities, or you can say that where one has come across during even the disciplinary proceedings, when the members came before us and there were no comments by them, and we have come across those deficiencies in the published financial statements for that matter. So I think it's a combination of all. And when I was in the quality review board at that particular point of time also, one looked at some kind of financial statement which had some kind of deficiencies. So it's a combination of many things that I will be talking to you. Some of the things you may find to be very simple, but if those simple things have been ignored, I think it's all the more serious to have it ignored, simplest of the simple things. And these will be primarily connected with the accounting standards for that matter. And of course, so some of the presentations in the schedule 3, earlier schedule 6. So all those matters will be covered by me. I may not be able to cover all the accounting standards non-compliances, but I will definitely try to cover as much as possible, maybe 8 or 10 of the accounting standards I think I will be able to cover in this period. And if more, I will definitely tend to cover more of those accounting standards. But I will like to go with the practical examples rather than talking something theoretically about it. And then we'll like to bring out my points before you. And if at all you have any questions, I think I will reserve last 15 minutes for the questions. From now onwards, almost an hour and a half, that's almost 90 minutes, I will be devoting on my talk. And last 15 minutes, I will reserve purely for the various question answer sessions from the members and to be responded by me. And I think that's the format which should suit everybody for from that angle. Now, when I look at few of the standards, the simplest of the accounting standards to my mind, the simplest of the accounting standard is AS1 for that matter. Now, when I talk of AS1 deals with the disclosure of the accounting policies, but then it lays down some basic fundamental principles. And fundamental principles with regard to accrual concept, fundamental principles with regard to the going concern concept, fundamental principles with regard to the consistency, etc. And when even those principles are not being followed in the published financial statements, and in some of the cases this has happened even in the case of the listed entities. And this particular accounting standard also requires that if at all you are disclosing all the accounting policies, and these policies have to be significant. These cannot be insignificant accounting policies. And also, not only the significant accounting policies have to be disclosed, the significant accounting policies have to be disclosed at one place. And in the same font also. It shouldn't happen that one significant accounting policy you disclose in a particular manner and the other significant accounting policy you club under certain other notes, basically, or under some schedule, etc. That you cannot do. But believe me, in practical life, all those kind of situations happen. I will come to you some of the practical examples in that case. There is a concept of accrual system. I think we all know, and That's the basic principle of the accounting. And AS1 says that if at all the accrual system of accounting has not been followed, in that case, I am supposed to even comment upon. And in any case, it is presumed that whenever we prepare the accounts, the accrual concept has been followed, because we are trying to match the expenses basically along with the incomes. And when the two are into the contest, whosoever wins, it is considered to be either a profit or a loss. If the income wins over the expenditure, it's a profit. If the expenses win over the income, then this becomes a loss. Now, the basic principle is that if at all I am into a contract with somebody, in that particular case, and if I am incurring some kind of an obligation, in that case, that liability will have to be provided for. I will now come up to one or two of the very significant cases before you in this particular case. In one of the, not one, I will say in a good number of listed entities, I'm using that word. When I say good number, if I have been able to touch upon 5 to 10 of such listed entities in which this particular note has appeared, and the auditors have not even tried to comment upon that, I think to me it's a serious matter. This note reads that since our account, these companies had borrowed it from the bank, funds from the bank, and they write in their notes of accounts, they have not provided for the interest liability on our borrowings from the bank, because the bank has treated our account to be a non-performing. Start thinking about it. I'm just trying to use this particular situation. What is the note? Our account has been treated as a non-performing account. It's a listed entity. All these are not only private limited companies. We have borrowed funds from bank, but bank has treated my account as a non-performing account. Since the bank has treated my account as a non-performing account and has not recognized the income books of account, so I'm not providing for the interest liability. Now, you look at the situation, the bank is bound by all the prudential norms. And when this prudential norms, the point that one is trying to tell you is that the bank is bound by prudential norms, and the prudential norms very clearly say that you receive either the interest or principal, either the you don't receive either principal or the interest.
Sir, that voice is breaking. Some maybe internet connectivity and video is also not coming.
My screen, my face is appearing.
If you speak a little closer to the system, then it will be fine, sir. Because it is the members are mentioning that voice is breaking, audio is breaking like that.
Is it okay or still it is breaking?
Yeah.
Is it breaking still or is it okay? Or I will like to connect.
Sir, now it is okay, sir.
It's okay.
Now it is okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So what I was trying to tell you is I can repeat the example that in these listed entities, I found there was a note to the accounts that the companies had not provided for interest on borrowings from the banks because the banks had treated the accounts to be non-performing account. The point that I am trying to drive you home is that the bank treated a particular account as a non-performing account and did not recognize the income thereon because of the prudential norms. They are bound by the prudential norms laid down by the Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India says that if they have not received the interest or the principal or both from any of the borrower constituents, in that case, they are supposed to treat this particular account as a non-performing account and they cannot book the interest till the time it is realized. But so far as the company is concerned, from the company's perspective, it is an accrued liability. You can't say that I will not pay, because you have actually entered into a contractual arrangement that you will continue to pay the interest to the bank. Now you defaulted on your interest payment, and because of your default, the bank had to actually treat your account as a non-performing account. How can the company say that I will not provide for the interest liability, and the auditor keeps silent on that particular matter? And this is the case in the case of the listed entities, mind it. In some of the, I can use the word few of the entities. There's no way that I couldn't have accrued the liability on account of interest, because interest is the moment I borrow certain funds from the banks, the meter is on, and that meter will continue to be on till the time I pay back the amount to them. But unfortunately, here the company gets away with it. Neither the SEBI is asking the question nor someone else is asking the question why it should not be treated as an asset and liability. I'll give you another case which we audited way back in 1997, for that matter. It is an aviation company. And in this aviation company, what happened? They had borrowed huge amounts from the government of India. They had the government of India borrowings in their case. And before we became the auditors, the trend was, it was a simple trend. The company was saying, we have written a letter to the government of India to convert our borrowings into equity, and pending that, we are treating the interest on borrowings as a contingent liability. Now you think of a situation. I borrow the money from the government of India as a company, and it's on an interest rate. Basically, I write to the government a simple letter that you please convert our borrowings into equity. The government writes you back, your matter is under consideration, because in government every matter remains under consideration and every matter is under active consideration. That's the misvirtue. But the matter is never considered. Now for 6-7 years in this company, the same thing continued. That the company will come and show it to the auditors that we have written letter to the government, and the government every year there will be a new letter from a new joint secretary or under secretary that your matter is under active consideration. But there was no decision, and every time the company will say it's a contingent liability on the borrowings. But the beauty of the matter was, now you look at the other side of the picture. When they will compute the tax liability in respect of this, whatever profit was working out, because if they had debited the interest, there would have been a loss, 100%. And since they were showing a profit, since they were willing, they had to show a profit for various reasons. We all know what happens in the case of the government companies. So they kept on showing the profit, but for the purpose of computation of the tax liability, they will say that it's an asset and liability and deduct therefrom in the return of income. When they will compute the tax liability at the time of computation, based upon the decided case, they will say that it's an asset and liability and will continue to deduct. So at that particular point of time, we took a stand. We said, you cannot blow hot and cold in the same breath. There's no way that for the purpose of profit and loss account, you say it's a contingent liability, and for the purpose of tax computation, you say it's an asset and liability. Either you pay higher tax or you book the interest. You cannot have the two situations going on in the same company at the same time. And ultimately, we had to give an adverse opinion, because if we had debited the interest, believe me, the entire net worth of the company would have been lost. Subsequently, the situation was rectified. They booked the interest, their net worth was lost. Then the government pumped in more money to keep that going. But that's not the point. The point is, how can a company, and there have been auditors prior to us in that particular case, and in these listed entities which I was talking to you earlier, there are auditors, and they have not adversely commented upon it. They have not qualified the reports, basically, on this particular matter. How a company, I am again repeating, based upon the accrual concept, how can a company say under any circumstances that I will not provide interest on the borrowings which I have taken from the banks, because the bank has treated our account as a non-performing? So I thought this is my starting point with regard to the accrual. The other point with regard to the AS1 from that angle is, we all talk of significant accounting policies. Let me put it this way. And this AS1 very clearly talks of that material items. After all, when you choose an accounting policy, the accounting policy has to be chosen for the sake of the material items. You cannot have accounting policy for the items which are not at all material. Now go to the banks, public sector banks, listed banks for that matter. In the case of banks, find out what is the composition, what is the percentage of the locker rent to the total income of the bank. Because the banks can earn by way of interest on the advances, they can earn on the guarantee commission, they can earn on the LC commission, etc., etc. But find out if they earn the locker rent, what will be the percentage of the locker rent as a consequence of that. But every bank, every year, continues to mention that all other incomes other than the locker rent have been accrued on the, have been approved. As if locker rent is a significant item and it has been accounted for on a cash basis. I think we can jolly well say that all material items have been booked on the accrual basis. After locker rent is not a material item under any circumstances. If in a total revenue of say 4,000 crore or 5,000 crore rupees, if you don't accrue, say to the extent of 1 crore or 2 crore rupees, it's not a material item in any case to my mind. There's no way that somebody is going to hold you up for that particular part. But we as auditors, we want to be more prudent. There the management also wants to be more prudent in the case of the banks. And they keep on saying other than the locker rent, everything else. Why should you mention about locker rent at all? I don't see the reason why it should be done in that particular case. There's another thing that I will like to say is, in a good number of cases, believe me, even today, it's the unfortunate situation to be in with regard to AS1. AS1 very clearly says whatever accounting policies are there, significant accounting policies are there, all significant accounting policies are to be disclosed at one place. You just can't have a situation that whatever suits you to disclose properly, that you disclose in the main body, and whatever does not suit you to disclose, you disclose it underneath a particular statement for that matter. But it still continues to happen, believe me, that some of the accounting policies, we will just put it underneath a particular schedule and say that this is what is happening in this particular case. I don't think that's the way the accounting policies are to be disclosed in any case. And the other thing that I'm very, very serious about that, I think to me that defies absolute logic. So far, it has not been tested in courts of law, but I think with the class action suits becoming a part of the Companies Act, I am very clear that in the periods to come, it will be tested in the courts of law. I'm very, very clear on that particular part. What is that? We find in the accounting policies, in the notes, that an accounting policy with regard to a particular item has been changed during the year. I'm not challenging the change of the accounting policy. Let me be very clear about it. This accounting standard says you can change an accounting policy, but the fact and the effect of the change has to be given. But so far as the principles for change in accounting policy are concerned, these have been enumerated in the AS5. Those have not been given. AS5 only says that if you change, because consistency is the hallmark of accounting, it says that you should be consistent about your accounting policies. But if at all you choose to change an accounting policy, in that particular case, that the effect and the effect of the change in the accounting policy should be disclosed. This is what AS1 says. But AS5 at the same time says that if at all you want to change your accounting policy cannot be changed at the drop of a hat. Accounting policy can only be changed if at all any of the three conditions are met. I don't find a note on that, very frankly, and I think I don't find a document even with regard to that justification with the auditors, including myself for that matter. So I'm equally taking the blame for whatever is happening in the profession. AS5 says that accounting policy can be changed in any of the three circumstances. Number one, if there is a change of law. Number two, if there is change in accounting standard and that forces you to change an accounting policy, nothing can be done for that matter. So far, the finance leases and operating leases were being treated in one way. Now, under Ind AS now, once the 116 has come in, now even all operating leases also get onto the balance sheets of the lessees also, with the right to use in a mode of valuation which has been duly given. So you can change that accounting policy because the change in policy has been required by the Ind AS 116 in that particular case. Thirdly, it says if it leads to fairer presentation of the financial statements. Unfortunately, here accounting policies are changed only and only when it leads to a lovelier presentation of the financial statements rather than fairer presentation of the financial statements in most of the cases. There could be exceptions where it would be leading to fairer presentation of the financial statements. When I say lovelier, what do I want to say? If at all I was to go in for a public issue, I will change my accounting policy from WDV to straight line, and then I could take out the profits even in respect of the earlier years in this particular year because of this change in the accounting policy, and I could make my profit and loss account and the reserves position healthier than what it would be otherwise based upon the WDV method. And if I am subjected to MAT and WDV provides me a higher rate of depreciation, probably I will like to get into the WDV method rather than the straight line method of depreciation. Or change of the life of the dies, change of the life of molds, just based upon certain considerations other than the actual useful economic life of the asset. Whenever the accounting policies are changed as a consequence of that, I think that is not an acceptable situation to be in. But we continue to get these changes in accounting policy without even discussing. Of course, the AS5 does not require me to discuss, very frankly, but I think the documentation has to be done by the auditor in any case. Why the accounting policy has undergone a change, whether it actually leads to fairer presentation of the financial statements or not. So my humble request to you is, wherever you are talking of a change in the accounting policy, you need to be absolutely clear, because believe me today, if the change in accounting policy leads to a lovelier presentation of the financial statement and if the listed entity, tomorrow you are going to be subjected 100%. I'm not talking of 99.9%. You will be subjected to certain kind of class action suits by somebody. Because gone are the days when the law of torts was not applicable in India. I think law of torts is applicable equally in India now, and in the years to come, any shareholder, any stakeholder suffering any kind of a loss from the published financial statements could even sue the auditor for that particular matter. So my humble request to you is, please start looking at these changes in the accounting policies. Another thing that baffles me is whether a wrong accounting policy followed once and disclosed can be validated because it has been followed consistently and it has been disclosed consistently. I think the answer to this lies with the British Paints case. I think that case started somewhere in 1964, and thanks to our judicial system, that case came to a conclusion somewhere in 88, 89, if I'm not mistaken. And it went up to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in that case decided. And it said that if a wrong accounting policy has been chosen and it has been followed consistently and has been disclosed consistently, despite that, it does not become a valid accounting policy. I think this is the crux of everything, if you ask me. Today, what happens is that a company chooses, as I told you about that aviation company, you just can't follow a wrong accounting policy and can say that I've disclosed it, so I have absolutely nothing to lose. No, you just can't do it. There's no way that you can do it. You will have to follow a correct accounting policy. If accrual is the hallmark, accrual will have to be followed in that particular case. Unfortunately, what happens is that I follow a particular accounting policy. Now, this is going to happen with India. This is going to happen more and more. Let me be very clear about it. Because Indians are going to lead to more subjectivity than objectivity. To me, the greatest challenge that FRRB, the Financial Reporting Review Board of the Institute, would face, Quality Review Board would face, NAFRA would face, or the Institute may face, is how to reduce this subjectivity within Indians for that particular matter. Because Indians is going to lead a lot of subjectivity, and I personally feel you choose something which is wrong. After all, when you even submit an auditor's report, which is called independent auditor's report under SA 700, what do you say? You very clearly say that accounting policies have been chosen by whom? The management. But you say that. But there is another line which is very important as an auditor, which I have to be very clear about. And I say that all those accounting policies are sound, and I have reviewed that those accounting policies are sound. I think that's very, very important. We just can't ignore that particular fact. Whatever accounting policy a company may choose, whatever accounting policy a company may choose, I will come to, when I come to AS7, I will talk of certain other things. I can quote it right now rather. In AS7 very clearly says that whenever it's a case of escalation over and above the agreed one, whenever it is a case of extra items, whenever it's a case of extra claims for that particular matter under AS7, and you claim that I have used a different quality of product than what was agreed upon, but this is having a higher cost. AS7 very clearly says that unless and until the customer has agreed to that kind of a situation, has agreed to that kind of a claim, or there is something which is reflecting that he's more or less agreed to that, you cannot book it as income under any case. You can't treat it as a revenue under any circumstances. But believe me, in a large number of companies, it keeps on happening by disclosing that extra items, escalation beyond the agreed amount have been booked as revenue because there is almost a certainty. But what is that certainty? It's not available at all. The customer has not agreed, and it will say the customer has not agreed so far, but the management is confident of recovery. Or the management is always confident of recovering everything on the earth, basically. I'm not bound by what management feels, because I'm not even bound by the management representations. I'm supposed to test it under 580. Because unless I test those management representations, I just cannot say that those management representations are correct. The management will say that these are the checks, all checks in hand. I'll say if the management writes that all checks in hand have been shown in the balance sheet and the debtors have been reduced consequently as thereof, can I book it as checks in hand if these are posted in checks in hand? I cannot reduce the debtors in that particular case, and I cannot show that as checks in hand, because that reflects the position absolutely absurdly, because I am trying to show more balance in the bank, because checks in hand will mean that it is cash or cash equivalent, whereas the debtor is not cash or cash equivalent. So what I am trying to say is that even in presentation, at times people try to commit harakiri in those cases, depending upon relying upon the management representation. So my humble submission to you is, whenever an accounting policy is chosen, in the case of British Paints, what was done? The company kept on valuing the work in progress at direct cost. One of the assessing officers, right around 1964, He rejected their books of accounts. He said, I don't agree. You are not showing the correct profitability, because the correct profitability will be shown when you value the work in progress at the absorption costing basis and not at the direct cost basis. The company said, we have been doing it for years together and we have been disclosing it and it has been accepted by everyone. Why should we today our books of accounts be rejected? It continued at different appeal stages basically. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said in 1988 or 89 that it was a wrong accounting policy, and a wrong accounting policy, if chosen and selected and applied and disclosed for years together, it does not become a valid accounting policy. So my humble submission to you is avoid these kind of errors. If a client has chosen a wrong accounting policy to book the revenue, when I come to AS9, I will show you how the revenue has been wrongly booked, though disclosed as a matter of policy thereof. Suppose I as an institute, I quote you because if any of my council colleagues are also listening to this, if the entire receipt that I receive in respect of the student fee, I book in 1 year, is it possible? And if I disclose that the entire income in respect of the receipt has been booked, because there is a matching concept, my services are going to be rendered over a period of time. I just can't book it. Though the policy has been disclosed, it does not become a valid accounting policy in any case. So my request to you is, whenever you look at an accounting policy, whenever you review a particular accounting policy, review it from the viewpoint that it has to be in consonance with the various accounting standards. If not in consonance with the accounting standards, suppose there is no accounting standard on that, probably the concept of prudence would be more applicable in that case. And whatever are the general principles of accounting, that should be made applicable to that particular policy. So again, I will say, please go with the accounting standards to follow a particular accounting policy. We just can't contravene a particular accounting policy just otherwise. When I come to and of course, some of the companies follow very, very aggressive accounting policies. I don't want to name some of the groups in the country which have been known for following aggressive accounting policies. And since they follow aggressive accounting policy, and that is why the bankers have come to grief and the companies have come to grief. I personally feel whatever accounting policies I go through, it has to be sustainable. And it has to be based upon the sustainable principles also at the same time. I'll give another example here. Suppose a company has already decided to liquidate some of its activities, substantial part of the activities. And I think under COVID-19, this is going to be one of the most crucial issues today. When you are going to audit the hotels, you are going to audit the tour operators, you are going to audit, for that matter, some of the entities where the COVID-19 has impacted their revenues very, very adversely. You will definitely look at 570, revised 570, SA 570, no doubt about it. You will look at the principles enunciated therein, along with AS1 also, which talks of going concern. Now, if they have actually decided to close down the activity, or you feel that it cannot be revived because of COVID-19, then should the cost concept remain relevant in those cases? The answer is no. Simply because the management may feel something. I don't think that can be the case, but that's out of the auditing. I'm focusing right now on the accounting side of it. When I am trying to focus on the accounting side, I'm only trying to say that in such circumstances, wherever the management has actually, if they put it in the notes, basically themselves, and in the management commentary itself, that they have decided to close down some of the substantial part of the activities, those assets and liabilities cannot be valued at the cost basis. There's no way. Because if I have decided to close down, I have communicated it to the world at large, my debtors are not going to pay me the full amount. No way that they are going to pay me the full amount. And same way, I'm not going to make the full payment to the creditors. I think the effect thereof will have to be taken into consideration. I think these are some of the pitfalls which we find even in the published financial statements in the case of the listed entities also. It was in 1985, 86, for the first time I came across, after 10 years of my practice basically, that in Modi Spinning and Weaving Mills, at that time the auditors were P.R. Mehra and Company, and they had commented that this organization is not a going concern, and that qualified the report. My hats off to them at that particular point of time. So what I'm trying to say is, please look at those kind of situations. Look at, if at all the management itself says that this is not a going concern, or they say somewhere that they have decided to, they will not say it is not a going concern, but if they say that they have decided to close down substantial part of the activities, can this be treated as a going concern still? When I say substantial part of the activities, that's very, very important. And then how to value their assets and liabilities in that particular case. Can these continue to be valued at cost in that case? Can I say that though the management says that yet I am valuing it at cost? I don't think that kind of situation is possible in those cases. Now coming over to AS2. When we talk of AS2, I think when I entered the council in 98 for the first time in January, in AS2 there used to be almost 10 methods, maybe more even. I have forgotten that. And one of the methods was called base stock method, which I have never been able to understand. What is that method? The department was always after us that inventory valuation constitutes the most important aspect of valuation. But you have not made this particular accounting standard mandatory. It was revised on lines of the international accounting standard, that's IAS2. And it laid down some basic fundamental principles. But those fundamental principles are being violated even today in some of the cases. And you can get that. FRRB has come out with so many observations in this particular regard. It is difficult to think of how so many people can actually be found at fault with regard thereto. This standard says very clearly today that earlier it used to say cost or market value, whichever is less. Today it talks of it is lower of the cost or net realizable value. One thing that it very clearly lays down now is that the only method that you can follow is absorption costing method. You cannot have direct cost method. Today, if you say that work in progress has been valued at direct cost, I think the accounts can be thrown out, because everything has to be at absorption cost. Whatever has been incurred, whatever costs have been incurred to bring their goods to the present condition and location, that's very, very important. The other thing that you need to be very careful about is, it very clearly says for the purpose of as a method of valuation, you have to follow only FIFO method. There's no other method that you can follow. You cannot follow LIFO method. It is presumed whatever has come first is out first. So the costing has to be matched with the revenue in that particular case. And whatever is remaining in the stock, that is out of the last stock which was purchased. So whatever is the cost at the end, basically, of the last invoice, probably in that case, or maybe 2 or 3 last invoices, that will be taken as the cost of the materials or components or supplies. This is one thing. Of course, today there is a lot of demand that we should shift back to the LIFO method also. One particular group has been after the institute that you allow LIFO method to be followed. I don't think that would ever be agreed now, but that's the way the things are happening. The point that I'm trying to again bring to your knowledge is, when it talks of net realizable value, lower of the cost or net realizable value. Finished goods can be valued at what? Cost or net realizable value, basically. Raw materials are generally valued at cost or net realizable value. But in their case, what will be net realizable value? That's very important to understand. Now, in some of the cases, it has been said that finished goods have been valued at the selling price. I can tell you, you come across and you come to the banks in the balance sheets which have been signed by the auditors, it says finished goods valued at selling price. Can it be done? The answer is no. There's no way that you can value the finished good at the selling price. You have to look at what is your cost and what can be the other costs which might be incurred to bring the goods to their condition and location, and value it accordingly. And if at all it can fetch you a lower price, then what is the cost? In that case, the net realizable value will be calculated. That's how it will be. Under COVID-19, this has assumed great significance. You look at the situation today, Indian Oil Corporation purchased petrol at a particular rate. Now, after 31st of March, the prices of petrol have actually come down. The crude has come down drastically in the world market. On one of the days, it was negative also. Now, you may say that selling price has remained the same in the market. That selling price has not remained the same for IOC. IOC has to sell it at a lower price. Let's be clear about it. You are getting it at the same cost because the government has felt the pulse that we people have been able to consume. We have become accustomed to a particular price of the petrol and diesel, and they can keep on, the petrol pumps can keep on selling at the same rate. So governments have, either the state government or the central government have enhanced their duties. But whatever are the duties which are added by the government, that does not become a cost of Indian Oil. That's the problem. And that does not become the realizable value for the Indian Oil. If the Indian Oil purchased at, say, 60 barrels, $60 per barrel, and is able to sell it at only $35 per barrel, in that case, the price has to be reduced. There's absolutely nothing that can be done about it. But the unfortunate part is, people, I have seen another balance sheet of late, where, and it's a C&AG audit, believe me, where the auditors have said that though we find that the realizable value is lower, but because of certain reasons, whatever, I don't want to get into the details thereof, but I can tell you, it is committing harakiri of the first order. You just can't do it. If the petrol, if the diesel cannot be sold at the same rate at which you had actually purchased it, there is no way that you can continue to value it on 31st of March at the same rate. After all, the prices have fallen drastically. Mere disclosure is not going to help you. The condition of COVID-19 existed on the date of the balance sheet. I am taking up AS4 simultaneously. AS4 very clearly says that if at all the conditions exist on the date of balance sheet, which are further corroborated by events subsequent to the date of the balance sheet. What was the condition? Condition was COVID-19. It was there on 31st of March itself. And it got corroborated by the event subsequent to the date of balance sheet that the prices actually fell. You couldn't sell it at higher price because of COVID-19. Let's be clear about it. In that case, you cannot value the petrol and diesel at the same rate at which you should have it. The same thing has happened to some of the actually consumer goods also. There's no doubt about it. But then it has not happened to medicines. Medicines rather could have been sold at a higher price for that matter. The point that I'm trying to drive you home is that when the finished goods are to be valued, these have to be valued at cost or lower of the cost or net realizable value. Unfortunately, particularly under COVID-19, the situation is going to be different. And the other point that one will like to say is that in this particular case, there are number of companies where the balance sheets very clearly bring out one particular part, that work in progress has been valued at cost. What cost? Direct cost or absorption cost? And whether it has been valued at lower of the cost or net realizable value, I think that is something which needs to be taken care of. I think I am still getting some of the voice issues. Ravindra ji, am I audible to most of the people or
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible, sir.
I'm audible? Okay.
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Yeah,
You are audible, sir.
because
I'm listening. I'm listening you fully.
in between certain times the line comes not
No, no,
voice.
sir. It is audible, sir. If any, it is not audible, then definitely members will chat box they will put it, sir.
Oh, okay.
I am sitting and fully watching. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm still on AS2 only. That's my
Okay.
problem. So some of the companies have been disclosing, and this is what the finding of the FRRB is. It is not even my finding. They will say that work in progress has been valued at cost. Which cost? Absorption cost, direct cost. Or if suppose the work in progress cannot be realized at the same at the cost which has been actually built in, then what happens? So you can't have that kind of situation. I will give you just one example right now. And this is an example which I have picked up from the branch audit of mine last year. This particular company was valuing the work in progress. And whenever the stock auditor would go, well, I'm not bothered about what the stock auditor was doing. I'm only trying to tell you what was happening. It always used to say that we value the work in progress at cost. It is a 1200 crore rupees worth loan from the various banks. Let me be very clear about it. Now, this company would say that we value the work in progress at cost. When we worked out the average selling price of the product, it worked out to 1200 rupees per kg or 1300 rupees per kg. And the valuation at which the work in progress was being done, it was 23 or 2400 rupees per kg. You think of a situation, I am valuing my work in progress at 2300 or 2400 rupees per kg, whereas my realizable value of the finished product. Now, I was trying to ask them that suppose you are valuing it at 2300 rupees or 2400 rupees, you may add another 200 rupees or 300 rupees to this as a cost. But if your average sale price of this particular product, the finished product, is only 1200 or 1300 rupees per kg, is the bank funding the losses? I'm not on funding of losses by the bank, but what I am trying to say is the management is valuing its work in progress at cost. Why they are doing? Their sole objective is to get the drying power. Nothing else, nothing short of that. But at the same time, their average sale price is 1200 rupees. How you can value the work in progress at 2300 or 2400 rupees per kg? There's no way. This entire formula, their entire accounting policy of valuing it at cost was absolutely ridiculous, because it should have been valued at the net realizable value in any case. So the point I am trying to make out to you is, it is most unfortunate that under different circumstances, we look at different kind of situations, and depending upon the convenience, the managements tend to bring out the accounting policies which suit them. There is one particular paragraph in this particular accounting standard which should go in favor of the clients, which should go in favor of the industry rather than what we are actually looking at. This paragraph 24 very clearly says that if there are materials, components or supplies, and if there are conversion costs in respect thereof, if your sale price is equivalent to the total of these material costs, component cost or supplies cost plus conversion cost is equal to or more than this if your selling price, you need not write down the value of the materials or supplies or components even if their prices have actually come down. I will give you the example. Suppose there is a material A, there is a material B, there is a material C, which gets into the production of the item D. Now, suppose I buy A at 100 rupees. I buy B at 75 rupees. I buy C at 50 rupees. And conversion cost is 25 rupees. Suppose my purchase of some of the stocks which are still lying with me are out of the purchase of 100 rupees, out of the 75 rupees, out of the 50 rupees. But the subsequent prices of these components have actually come down by, say, 100 has become 80, 70 has become 70, 75 has become 70. So 80 and 70 would mean 150 plus the third component remains at 50, 200 rupees. This particular paragraph says I need not write down the value of the inventory lying at 75 rupees, at 100 rupees in case my conversion cost plus this component cost is recoverable by the selling price, which would mean that if I can recover 250 rupees, if my selling price is 250 rupees, I need not bother. If my selling price is less than 250 rupees, in that particular case, the write down should happen. So the point, whereas when I send my article for the audit, I always tell him that if an item has been purchased at 100, the other item and the same item has been bought at 80, if the earlier item is also lying, you may please try to write down the value of this particular inventory also. No. In this case, the net realizable value will have to be seen along with the conversion cost being recovered through the selling price. If my selling price is equivalent to the total cost of the material plus my conversion cost, in that particular case, I will not need to write down the value of inventories in these cases. I think this is one of a very, very significant part of the AS2, which tends to be ignored. The other thing is the valuation of joint products and byproducts, basically. Byproducts have to be valued different and joint products have to be valued differently. Byproducts are generally not of significance. So the byproducts you can value at the realizable value at this tab, even whatever quotations you have received from somebody, you can value them. These need not be treated at the cost basis in any case. Whereas the joint products at the time of segregation, their cost will have to be determined in all those cases. Look at the sugar industry. When the molasses is segregated, in sugar industry, you have two kind of products. One is the joint product in the form of molasses, and the other one is the bagasse in the form of a, you can say, byproduct. Bagasse is, you can sell at any kind of a rate, basically. It's nothing but just the scrap kind of a situation to be in. Whereas molasses is the most important thing. So that there you have to be far more careful when you are valuing. So valuation of joint products will have to be done far more carefully. It may or may not happen because people don't try to even reach the cost of the joint product in some of the cases. Very frankly, the formula given for the valuation of the joint product and byproduct is not clear in some of the balance sheets, some of the financial statements. I will only request the people to be a little bit more careful in this situation. The other thing is, when I talk of cost, in some of the cases it has been found in the financial statements, even of the listed entities, believe me, that finance costs have been included as a part of the borrowing costs have been included as a part of the cost of the inventories. Now there, if I read AS16 along with AS2, S16 talks of qualifying assets, and qualifying assets are not only the property, plant, and equipment. These can even be the inventories, because it very clearly says that those are the kind of assets, qualifying assets are those which take substantially long period, basically, before they're complete for their acquisition, or they're being manufactured, before it is being ready for the purpose of sale. Sale will be in the form of inventory, or for the purpose of being put to use, or ready to be put to use. So the point that I'm trying to drive you home is, generally in the case of inventories, which is of repetitive nature, you don't have to capitalize the borrowing cost. You should not be capitalizing the borrowing cost, because the borrowing costs have to be capitalized only if it falls under the category of the qualifying asset. Wine could be one, because the more you mature the wine, the better price realization you get as a consequence thereof, for that matter. Or if during the two processes, one such process is there, after which it has to wait for, say, a period of 6 months or 8 months or 3 months before it can be actually taken to the next stage, then it is a part of my entire production process. So in that case, you must still be able to capitalize the borrowing cost. Not in the normal circumstances. People have been asking a question that in the case of sugar industry, where you produce in 1 year, one particular half year, you sell it in the next half year, whether the borrowing cost in respect thereof can be capitalized as a cost of the inventory. To my answer is no. It's a repetitive production. The stocking of the sugar is not adding any value to sugar, for that particular matter. In the case of wine, the wine undergoes changes in the quality. It undergoes a changing characteristic wise, basically, whereas sugar can only be damaged. It does not improve in quality because of being stocked as a consequence thereof. It's another matter that right now you may be able to get 50 rupees per kg. Tomorrow you might be able to get 60 rupees per kg. So you cannot say that the quality of the sugar has gone up. No way. The characteristics are not improved. What has improved is the price because of other factors, maybe the demand factor or some other factor. And wherever those kind of factors are involved, the borrowing cost cannot be capitalized. Whereas in the case of the qualifying asset, the borrowing cost may be capitalized, even in the case of some of the inventory. Say, take the case of a real estate person. When he produces flats, when he actually creates flats, in that case, it is known that it is going to take substantial period of time. He may be able to capitalize that over the inventory cost. As it can form a part of his work in progress, it can form a part of his total cost, but not in the case of the sugar production, etc. But believe me, there are financial statements where you can find that finance costs have been capitalized, even in the case of the repetitive production. My humble request is it should be avoided to the extent possible, for that particular matter. There can be circumstances where selling expenses have been added to the cost, contrary to the entire thing, and this at times gets reflected in the accounting policy. My request to each one is, please avoid doing those kind of situations to be in. Events subsequent to the date of balance sheet I have already discussed to some extent. AS5, prior period items versus exceptional items, extraordinary items. Now this is one standard, which is again, whenever one used to read it during late 80s, one used to feel such a small accounting standard is there. What is so great about this particular accounting standard? But over the years, one realized that this is one of the most abused or misused, or you can say most commonly misunderstood accounting standard. We were not able to even fathom the idea what constitutes a prior period item. And particularly when we used to go to income tax Awala will always think that whatever pertains to the earlier year is a prior period item. Thanks to Section 145, under which the two of the accounting standards were actually pronounced by the income tax department itself, and which defined prior period, that the income tax officers also had to understand what is a prior period item. Because the prior period item is only those debits or credits which arise as a consequence of any error or omission committed at the time of preparation of the financial statements in any of the earlier years. You just can't treat something as a prior period item simply because it pertains to the earlier year. There are cases where the organizations have entered into agreements with the trade unions during the current year and have made them the wage payments in respect of the earlier years also, arrears of those. And they have treated that as a prior period item. No, that cannot be treated as a prior period item. Because if the agreement has actually taken place this year, there was no error or no omission done at the time of the preparation of the financial statements in the earlier years. Because at that time there was no agreement at all. Even if you are paying the arrears of wages of the earlier years during the current year, when the agreement has taken place, at the most, it can be treated as an exceptional item if it is high in amount. And you want to make somebody reads the impact of this wage arrears over the current year cost on the wages. You can very well say in the notes itself that the wages include this much in respect of the earlier year wages, so that the reader of the financial statement understands that if I compare the wages of the last year and this year, it is not that this year wages are distorted. Rather, he comes to know that this has been paid because of an agreement which has taken place between the unions and the management this year, and as a consequence of that, this particular thing has been done. Then there is something called extraordinary item. Earlier, anything which was major in amount, very frankly, used to be treated as an extraordinary item. No, I think this even happens today in some of the cases. Thankfully, SEBI has laid down a particular format which talks more of exceptional items than extraordinary items, to be very frank. And I think that's a good job done. Ordinary items are those which you do in the course of the business. At times, some of those items could be exceptional items. I will deal with that. But extraordinary is something which does not arise in the normal course of the business. There can be a fire, there can be a flood, there can be a drought, there can be an earthquake, which has nothing to do with my business, but it happens. And as a consequence of that, I have to incur some kind of expenses, huge expenditure. I either incur a loss or I incur an, or I get something as a consequence thereof. So that could be treated as an extraordinary item. But extraordinary item does not mean which arises in the normal course of the business, because extraordinary definition is such which has nothing to be which is not connected with the business in the real sense of it, and which is not repetitive in nature in any case. Whereas exceptional item is connected with the business. So when you get the balance sheet, when you get the P&L account today, you come across the profit or loss before exceptional item, after exceptional item. Because suppose as a consequence of some reason, some agreement, because of COVID-19, certain things might become exceptional. But very frankly, wherever there are contractual liabilities, if you are making payment in respect of the contractual liabilities of the labor, it does not become because the turnover has come down, so it becomes an exceptional item. People are trying to do it, believe me, this year. What people are trying to do is that if the sales have come down and the wages remain the same, they say the wages this year as an exceptional item because the sales have come down. Sales might have come down even otherwise. when the sales come down otherwise or sales go up otherwise, you can't treat the wages reduction or wages enhancement as an as an exceptional item. Whatever is your contractual liability. Yes, if the government says tomorrow, because you are supposed to do this. Suppose you have the contractual labor. When I say contractual labor, you have the daily labor working for you besides your engaged labor who are on your rolls. And the government says you cannot dispense even with this contractual labor, the daily labor. Probably that could be treated as an exceptional item, not otherwise. Because you had the authority to dispense with those services. But do you have the authority to dispense with these people? You are not doing it voluntarily because probably in some of the cases you think that you have already trained them enough, and when you will employ new people after terminating them, in that case you will have to incur more of the training costs. So that cannot be treated as exceptional item. But some of the industries, believe me, are trying to play smart in this particular case also, and they are trying to put in as if it is to be treated as an exceptional item. My answer is no. If the sales has come down, it cannot be treated as an exceptional item. That the difference in the two sales. No, if the purchases have, after all, if the purchase prices have come down as a consequence thereof, can you treat it? No, no way. Today, we are all operating from home. Our expenses, our revenue may come down, no doubt about it. But at the same time, we are able to save on our office air conditioners cost, our lighting cost, our commuting cost, etc. These do not become exceptional items in those cases, basically. But yes, because of government directions, if I'm bound to incur something as a consequence of COVID-19, this could become an exceptional item in those cases. That's the point I'm trying to make out to you. So exceptional item has to be treated as a different footing compared to the extraordinary item. As I said, it might very well happen that you have entered into a contract with an advertiser and you have been running an ongoing dispute with him, and in one of the years you agree to his demand, okay, I will give you more credit, and you allow him more credit. That can become an exceptional item this year because the dispute was going on. It is very much possible that you have got certain um, cases in arbitration, and because of arbitration you have lost out something or you have won something. That could be treated as an exceptional item, but that does not become an extraordinary item because that's connected with the business for that matter. So what I am trying to tell you is, somewhere or the other, we have to be very conscious of the fact what is a prior period item, what is an exceptional item, and what is an extraordinary item. Somewhere or the other, we get lost in those cases. I think in under AS7, I have already explained you one particular part, that is with regard to extra items, with the claims with regard to the escalation, the claims with regard to, you can say, the better quality product being used. All those things I've already explained. But one thing that remains from my side is, AS7 is very clear on one thing. Suppose you have a fixed price contract, and in the fixed price contract, the situation is you have taken the contract at a value of 1 crore rupees, and you are supposed to complete it with total cost of about 80 lakh rupees. You have progressed physically to the extent of 50%, but you have already spent 70 lakh rupees on that. In that case, this contract becomes onerous on you. Please refer to AS29 also at the same time. This particular contract becomes onerous on you. You are bound to incur a loss as a consequence of this, virtually to the extent of 40 lakh rupees. If you can assess it reasonably well, that loss has to be booked today. You cannot defer that particular loss. It's very, very important. And then what is happening? One is that these onerous contracts are not being considered by some of the companies, and you can make out. If you look at the progress of the work, you can very well make out from the financial statements itself, because the auditors will like to give here and there something in the published financial statements, or management will like to say something without booking those losses. The other thing is that if a particular contract has not actually progressed to a reasonable level, in that particular case, you cannot book any revenue. When I say revenue in this sense, you cannot book a profit also as a consequence thereof. Suppose you have floated, you have actually accepted a contract, overall contract, in which your expected revenue is a crore of a rupee. You expect total cost to be of about 75 lakh rupees. You expect that 25 lakh is going to be your profit. Now, suppose you have so far completed work of only 5 lakh rupees. You cannot book a profit which is so insignificant. But people still do it, which is in virtual violation of AS7 for that matter. So once it progresses, say about 20%, 25%, in that case, you can start booking the profit, because ultimately you find that 25 lakh is going to be your profit. And if you have reached 25% and everything else is under control, you can take that much as a profit. No doubt about it. But when you are applying percentage completion method, you have to be very, very conscious about the stage or the progress of the work, and also at the same time, not only in the fixed contract, even here, whether a contract can become onerous contract at any point of time. If it can become onerous contract, please book the losses in that case. If the contract has not progressed beyond a particular stage, in that particular case, what you can do in these cases is only and only to see one thing, and that is that you debit the work in progress. That you can definitely treat it as a work in progress, and at the most you can debit the party's account. After all, you may treat something as a party's account only to the extent of the cost. You cannot say that you can recover from the party more than the cost in those cases. So that's my humble request to all of you. But I think in a good number of accounts which one goes through, when I say good, I will say it varies from few to some, basically, that one comes across these situations, that those are not rightly reflected therein. The other thing, when I come to AS10, particularly with regard to property, plant and equipment, here I have got some more points than in the normal compared to the other accounting standards. And I am linking it up with AS16 also again, somewhere or the other, because suppose I am setting up a particular project, and I will give you examples very frankly. I'm setting up a particular project, or I'm acquiring a particular machinery which is going to be installed, but it is going to take some time. Now, suppose a situation like COVID-19 happens, and my project comes to a standstill for a period of 6 months, or maybe more, or for a longer period. The point is whether the costs incurred during this particular period of interest and other expenses, can those be capitalized, or should those be charged off to revenue? I can tell you, all these cases which you are going through IBC today, it is very strange to find out that in case of some of the industries, there is one particular to take a huge hit, because in some of the cases 50% or 55% of the total cost of property, plant and equipment was nothing but this capitalization of interest and the salaries and other expenses. Now, if there is an abnormal delay in completion of a particular project, If there is an abnormal delay in installation of a plant and machinery, in that particular case, the expenses which are being incurred in respect thereof, particularly the indirect expenses which are being incurred thereof, incurred in connection therewith. You see, if I bought a machinery in any case is to be capitalized. But if my people are sitting there for 6 months doing nothing, or my people are sitting there for 3 months doing nothing, because of the floods or because of anything else, or it can be because of earthquake, in that particular case, there is nothing. Believe me, that's nothing that can be capitalized by me. But we keep on doing year after year, months after months, this kind of capitalization. Most unfortunate situation to be in, believe me. And that is why today when the banks go for the haircuts, you know what is the kind of haircut that the banks are taking in IBCs? In IBC, the haircut which is being taken by the banks is to the extent of about 70 to 75% on an average I am talking of. In a company like Alok Industries, they took a 83% haircut. Why? I think we have to do a lot of self-introspection, and the managements have to do a lot of self-introspection. The capitalization of the cost has been absolutely fallacious in those cases. So my humble submission to you is, please start looking at these kind of situations. When I'm implementing a project, when I'm installing a plant and machinery, when I'm doing certain other things, I just cannot allow a situation to drift apart so much. If at all there are expenses which I have incurred during these abnormal periods, I just cannot capitalize, but this keeps on happening time and again, believe me. My AS16 also says the same thing what I am saying. It says if it's a normal stoppage, if it's a normal suspension of the activity, there's no problem in that particular case. But if it's abnormal, in that case, those borrowing costs have to be charged off to revenue. And similar is the principle with regard to the other expenses. So my request to you is please start looking at those kind of situations. Then whatever are going to be my dismantling costs, because today, if I look at the property, plant and equipment, it says that whatever is going to be the cost of restoration, tomorrow, suppose you leave that particular place and you have to restore that place to a particular level. Even those costs have to be provided for, but what discounting rate will be taken, it's anybody's guess for that matter. But whether it is happening or it is not happening, I don't want to get into that. Believe me, but I definitely need to look at those kind of situations. I revalue the items. There are a number of issues in this, in the revaluation. Number one, I don't mention the basis on which it has been revalued. Whether it is based upon the registered value or whether I have just revalued, because the standard very clearly says it has to be revalued based upon the registered values report. And it should be mentioned very, very clearly. And now in Caro, in 2020, you will have to mention it if it is not done that way. And the other thing that this revaluation requires is that in case revaluation has been undertaken, whether the party had actually the right to transfer this particular asset or not. I still remember the case of one of the leading banks in this country, which has revalued its all land and buildings. They have revalued their land and buildings, even of the areas in which they have no transfer rights of those properties. In places like Northeast, where they have been allotted those properties by the government and have been told that till the time you continue to operate, it's fine. But you cannot transfer it to someone else. Can you revalue those properties? Those properties have to continue at cost. Because once you cannot transfer it to somebody, where is the question of the economic value to be more than what has been shown in the books of accounts? Unfortunately, it continues to be whatever it is. And in one of the banks, the RBI had to come up and say that you have to do away with about 10,000 crore rupees of revaluation. So what one is trying to tell you is, please be very, very clear. If you don't have a right to transfer a particular asset, there is no way that it can be revalued. If you have right is only right to use, how you can revalue that right to use? The right to transfer lies with someone else. So what is important, particularly in the case of the land and building, you have no right to transfer that particular property. You have been granted certain rights to you only to make use of yourself. There's no question of its revaluation. The other thing that you need to be very careful about is, and that is what is happening in a good number of cases, very frankly, it is happening in a good number of cases, and that is that I revalue one parcel of land, but I don't revalue the other parcels of land. If at all I revalue one particular asset, one class of asset, then the entire gamut of those, the entire gamut under that class of assets has to be revalued. Unfortunately, again, in some of the financial statements, you can make out very clearly that it has not happened in all. Under the same class of assets, everything has not been revalued. So you can't have a situation where you can do cherry picking, that some of the thing, because if somewhere the value has actually gone down in the land and building, then if you are actually revaluing your land and buildings, the entire gamut of the land and buildings of the entity will have to be revalued. You can't pick and choose which particular land and building you will revalue and which particular building you will not revalue in those cases. In a good number of cases, I think this position will be now rectified with the aging of the capital work in progress to be shown. And this may be required to be commented upon also. People have been continuing with certain kind of capital work in progress for ages. The assets have been put to use, but the assets still continue to be shown as capital work in progress. This is absolutely unpardonable. Why this is continued to be shown as a part of capital work in progress? Because the moment I transfer it to the asset, the depreciation on this will have to be charged. And if depreciation is charged, probably the entity gets into a loss situation, because they don't have that kind of a cushion in the profitability that the profitability can absorb that depreciation. Now, in the Schedule 3 itself, management will have to comment upon the aging of the capital work in progress next year. And the auditor will also have to have a look at it. So my request to you is, wherever capital work in progress has been lying for a long time, two things to be seen. Number one, whether in these cases the capital work in progress has been put to use. If it has been put to use, it has to be capitalized immediately. And secondly, in those there are cases, very frankly, where we bought computers, particularly in the IT system. There has been a lot of such issues, if you ask me. Computers have been bought in, computers are being used, but advance given to the party has not been adjusted so far. Because if you adjust the advance will be adjusted and the assets will be capitalized. And once the asset is capitalized, and particularly in the case of the IT systems, in some of the cases, the depreciation could be as high as about 33%. So your profitability has to take care of that situation. People have to be told, industry has to be actually taught that cash profitability is more important than the profitability in the profit and loss account. Today, even the bankers have to be told that they should go more by the cash generation than by anything else. But somewhere or the other, I think there is a fallacy of a situation that we continue to think that profit and loss account must show a profit. profit and loss account may show a profit, but if there is a liquidity crunch as per cash flow position, I don't think that's the right situation to be in those circumstances. The other thing is that the charges which are created with the bankers or with particularly the second charge, first charge is generally reflected in the books of account. Let me be very clear. It is only the pari passu charge which is conceded to someone else, or when it is the second charge or third charge on the assets, it is not disclosed. So probably that needs to be disclosed far more often in those cases. Assets retired from the active use. If certain assets have been retired from the active use, then their valuations have also to be taken care of. And their depiction has to be different. I think that's you run through the commentary of some of the financial statements in the case of the some of the companies, you come across that they say that we have retired the assets from active use in these particular cases, but you don't find that in the schedule of the fixed assets being treated that way. I think somewhere or the other we should start looking at it. If the asset has been retired from the active use, there are many other implications thereof. And when I come to AS 12 particularly, with regard to the grants, I have only one observation, which is very pertinent to my mind. And that situation is that if I got certain grant attached with certain conditions, and if I don't fulfill those conditions, this grant becomes refundable. I think if I have not fulfilled those conditions, suppose I received a grant 5 years back or 3 years back, it was that I must export this much of quantum out of this, and only for that particular purpose I've got the grant. And if I have not been able to fulfill it, then what happens? This is one error which creeps in wherever the grants in error have, wherever the grants in aid have been captured. We don't tend to, the managements after first year tend to forget what are their obligations, or the notes are drafted in a manner that these situations become quite opaque. Opacity is not the answer. I think transparency is the answer. If at all it is refundable, it's a current liability in any case. And I have to make it refundable to the organization concerned from where I have claimed the grant in aid in any case. And at times, I claim the grants for the revenue purposes, treat it as capital grants, and sometimes I claim it for the purpose of capital and treat it as revenue grants. I don't want to get into too much of very frankly the discussions. The other thing that one will like to talk about is particularly AS 22 before I go to anything else. In AS 22, there are, if I read paragraph 15 to 17 and 18 of AS 22 with regard to deferred taxes on income, it talks of under what circumstances the deferred tax asset can be created. It talks of virtual certainty, it talks of reasonable certainty. It says that if there are disallowances with regard to 43B, etc., you see, it's very common. If I have, and I will like to say it, if there is a bonus which is payable, it is very much expected that if somebody has not claimed this year, he will claim it next year. So if I have paid tax as a consequence of that, probably it will fructify into an asset recoverable in the subsequent period when I pay the bonus in that case. But when a particular entity has incurred the losses, there is unobserved depreciation, there are unobserved losses, carried forward losses as a consequence thereof. There, I can create a deferred tax asset out of it only and only when there is a virtual certainty that this particular deferred tax asset would be realized, which means that I should be virtually certain that in the years to come, there will be a profitability, and that profitability will be subjected to tax. And when that tax is becoming payable, I will be paying lower taxes because of the carried forward losses or unabsorbed depreciation. And that is how the deferred tax asset would be realized. I'll give you only one example. It is an Ahmedabad-based listed entity. And this Ahmedabad-based listed entity created a deferred tax asset of 62 crore rupees on account of unabsorbed depreciation and carried forward losses. And if you read their director's report, the first line of the director's report is, future outlook of the business is gloomy. The government policies are against the industry. Profit margins are shrinking, and company is likely to continue to incur the losses. Can you think of a situation where the board itself admits that the company will continue to incur the losses and still creates deferred tax asset rupees of 62 crore rupees and gets away with it from the auditors as well as from SEBI? It's a very sad reflection on the entire accounting. I'm not talking of auditors alone. I'm talking of the regulation even by the SEBI for that matter. If the board of directors in their report are writing that the future outlook of the business is gloomy and the company is likely to continue to incur the losses, and still the company is able to create a deferred tax asset of 62 crore rupees, I think it is criminal in nature, if you ask me. We blame public sector enterprises for many things, but I still remember when I was still in the council, maybe more than 13, 14 years back. At that time, Steel Authority, at one time, the steel prices had come down very badly. And Steel Authority in 3 years had incurred tremendous losses. And they had huge, in the real sense of it, huge uncarried forward losses. In one of the years subsequently, they earned a profit in one of the quarters. If Steel Authority had acted in an imprudent manner, in that particular case, they could have created the deferred tax asset of such a big amount, which is beyond one's comprehension. But what did they do? When they got the profit in the first quarter, they only projected the profit for the current year only, not for the subsequent periods of the profit, not for the subsequent periods of the organization. And they created deferred tax proportionate only to that. I think that is what is called prudence. Because otherwise they could have said, we have started getting into the profit and we will be able to realize the entire deferred tax asset. But they didn't resort to that. I think a classical case of prudence. And one more standard that I will like to cover before I really hand it over back to the organizers and then try to reply the questions in the 10 or 15 minutes, whatever I can do, basically, is with regard to S20, earning per share. Take the case of the private limited companies where this particular standard is applicable. Where it is not applicable, I am not talking about it at all. Where this particular standard is applicable, look at that situation. This paragraph 28 of the accounting standard says that suppose you receive share application money and deposit it in the same bank account in which your other monies are being deposited, from which you carry out the business. In that particular case, the EPS has to be diluted. And how many cases? Pick up the balance sheets of the various private limited companies and find out wherever the share application money has been there, whether at any point of time the EPS has been diluted in those cases. Whereas the share application money was always deposited in the normal bank account. Because why, what is the purpose of saying this? The purpose is that if you are utilizing this money in the business activity, then you have to treat it as that these shares are going to be issued, and this must be dilute the EPS. One is the basic earning per share, other is the diluted earning per share. I can tell you 95% of the balance sheets of the private limited companies don't dilute EPS in those cases. Please start looking at it a little bit more carefully. I think I will like to stop here, Koresa, because I personally feel that if at all there are 5-7 questions, I will like to answer that in the next 10 minutes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, please.
There are a few questions were asked by the Arvind sir. Can you sign the finance? Can you sign the financials is signed by the directors and editors using their DSC?
What?
Because this COVID situation, no, sir.
Yeah.
Whether they can sign this
So
finance.
if you are sure that they have signed it digitally, you can also sign it digitally.
Because
nothing stops you. But then you have to be sure that the two directors have signed it. The reason being, I can tell you, Mr. Ravindra, when we were doing, when last year I was the member of disciplinary committee which was doing South cases. Maximum cases which come up before us all over India today are cases either filed by the directors, one of the directors or one of the partners or one of the society members, whosoever feels aggrieved. And all these directors and partners know everything about the company or about the organization, and the auditor finds very difficult to defend. So I will like to say one thing very clearly, that if the auditor feels and if he is convinced that yes, these have been digitally signed by the two of the directors, he may go and sign. But if he is not convinced, he should not sign. Now I'm very clear on that.
yes, sir, because that section 134 of the Companies Act also not specify anything on this signing.
I'm very clear. Two signatures, whether digital or otherwise, have to be there of the directors. If they have not done it, I will not do it. No way I will do it.
Next,
In a good number of cases, people have been charged guilty of this. Let me also tell you that.
sir. Next question is: a company enter into agreement with government to renovate a government hospital and run it free of cost in future, in exchange for being permitted to construct a commercial hospital on government land, which will take 3 years. How should pre-hospital expenses be treated?
No, if you are treating it that you are doing certain renovations to that particular hospital, and as a matter of that, you are buying certain right, you can capitalize those expenses. I have absolutely no doubt on that. Because if you have bought a particular right to construct a hospital, after all, that's the cost that can be considered to be a right cost of the right to use. So probably it might be possible to capitalize those kind of expenses.
Yes, sir. One question is here after you are answering. The ROC Chennai sent one form for resubmission. They need manual signature. Also, one more query. The date of signed up financial statement may be little earlier than the date of we use the DSC. The DSC will reflect different date. It would be helpful if Institute can clarify and help in this matter.
I think only Institute will be able to clarify. I will not be able to say anything on this. But I personally feel don't commit these kind of things. If your digital signatures are being given there, then your signing should also be on the same date. Why do you want? And if you have given your digital signatures, why do you want to sign them physically again? See, after all, you will create UDIN, na? You will create UDIN on what date? The first time either you put digital signature or you first time when you do the signature, either of the two things. You will create UDIN with reference to that. You cannot create UDIN with reference to two of the dates. You will be able to create UDIN only with reference to one date. So you be very clear as to what you want to do.
Sir, if management prepares the financial statements and we discharge with the presentation whether qualification is required if there is a material misstatement.
Please repeat the question.
If management prepares the financial statements
Yeah.
and we disagree with the presentation,
100%, 100%, 100. How can you see, if as an auditor I don't agree to certain things, I'm left with no other choice but to qualify the report. It can be even adverse report. It can be a disclaimer. Many things can occur as a consequence thereof. So I think I will be following SA 705 in that particular case.
sir, in case of tech companies, product designing and expenses goes for years, whereas sale happens after 2-3 years. How to
No,
treat
I will only say one thing. If you are creating an app, suppose you are creating an app, till the stage of the research, your expenses have to be charged off. Once your research has ended and now it is available for commercial exploitation, whatever expenditure you incur subsequent thereto, that will be capitalized. That is as per earlier AS 8 for that matter, and now intangible asset standard also AS 26.
Yes, sir, that's it. The question I must thank because the presentation of your whole 2 hours presentation, sir, it is like we have taken a very little drop from the ocean.
I don't know, sir.
The experience, because many members are texting me personally also. The way you have covered all the topics, how financial statements and where the members, the common errors, and that common we have to overcome the situation. After listening your sessions, definitely our members has to overcome that all situations and the better presentation, and that will be a branding for the chartered accountants. And I must compliment Sir Nityananda sir has just messaged me, and he told he recalled and he thanked also personally. I also from Bangalore branch.
Very frankly, he is a very dear friend.
Yes,
I
sir.
cannot forget him. The person with whom you have worked in your very first committee and being in the council, you can never forget that person.
Yes, sir. He is always advisor and mentor for the Bangalore branch. Whoever will be the chairman, whoever will be the committee members, he is always guiding force for the managing committee of Bangalore branch. Nityananda sir, he can't forget, and the person who is served for 3 terms for the central council.
And
That's
technically one of the sound persons, very sound.
sir, yes, sir. So I am very much thankful, sir, for your presentation. I'm meeting you after 4 years, and Sikasa conference again. It is my proud privilege that to host a session, and you are sitting in the northern part of the country, and we are all the southern part of. Yes, your heart is in Bangalore. Yes, our members need many more sessions from you, sir.
I will only like to end up on one note. Stay safe.
Yes.
Stay home. Stay safe to the extent possible.
Yes, sir.
God bless you all. As I said, I am very closely connected with Bangalore for various reasons.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I can wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. On behalf of all the managing committee members, I wholeheartedly thank you, sir. And I thank all the more than 650 viewers are viewing. Very much thankful. Members, tomorrow we are having a sessions from real estate sector GST issues. From Advocate Vaideshwan is going to handle the session. Members, I hope that today's session definitely, sir, enlighten us in a very, he covered almost all the topics when he's saying AS the 7, and again he coming to the AS 22 and again SA, and where we have to connect it. That is his 45 years experience. As I initially told, this we have taken only little bit drops from the ocean. Definitely, sir, we need to have more sessions from your side. So I will not take much time. I request our Bangalore branch secretary Srinivas is waiting to formally thank you, sir, and all the viewers from Bangalore branch. Over to Srinivas. Thank you, sir, once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, it was a very informative and very useful session for the members, and very apt for the current situation, because majority of us are finalizing very few audits, not much because of Corona. All firms are not working full-fledged because majority of the firms employees and articles are working from home. Really, it was a very informative. and very exhaustive knowledge and experience you have on that topic, sir. Really, we are ever grateful to you for sharing your knowledge. I thank on behalf of Bangalore branch of ICA for your time and efforts sharing your valuable knowledge, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And I also thank all the members and viewers for actively participating in this webinar, sir. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.